Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report podcast. I'm your host, Vago Muradian. Our podcast is brought to you by Bell. Since 1935, Bell has been redefining flight. Learn more about its pioneering spirit at bellflight.com. And now it's my absolute pleasure to welcome Chris Brose, the former staff director of the Senate Armed Services Committee under the chairmanship of his late boss, Senator John McCain, who's now the head of strategy at Anduril Industries, and he's also the author of the extraordinary book, The Kill Chain: Defending America in the Future of High-Tech Warfare. Chris, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Vago. It's great to be with you.
And before we get started, our global coverage is sponsored by Leonardo DRS. Northrop Grumman sponsors our weekly cyber report and our broader cyber coverage. Fincantieri Marinette Marine sponsors our naval coverage. Elbit Systems of America has sponsored our Quad A and SOFIC virtual trade show coverage. And Bell, of course, sponsors this podcast. Absolute pleasure. As I said, I want to congratulate you for writing the book that I've long wanted to write. You explain how we got into this situation, what China's up to, what we need to do to fix the problem from the perspective of somebody who really worked elbow deep in these issues with one of the true giants of American national security. And you rightly note that it's time for a really radical shift for American military thinking away from small numbers of expensive manpower-intensive platforms to harnessing AI, machine learning, quantum sensing and computing, all of the commercial technologies that are making our lives easier to build sort of battle networks and move them out of the dark ages to being manned by fewer people with larger, controlling vaster quantities of less expensive smart machines. And really, you also make clear that the goal is Andy Marshall's goal, right? Impose more cost on the enemy than the enemy's imposing cost on you at a very time when Americans themselves, civilians, will be more vulnerable than they've ever been since 1812. Let's get to China as an adversary. So having studied them, right, they're all about sort of using our greed to fuel their wealth, to become a hyperpower, to set the rules as an authoritarian state around the world. Talk to us about some, and it's very Sun Tzu, right? Win without fighting, become so formidable that you can get what you want without going to war. Talk to us about what they are specifically doing that is so dangerous and what's at stake if they succeed.
Yeah, so at a broader level, I think China poses a strategic challenge to the United States. And, in the book that I've written, I'm very much focused on the military dimension of that problem. But to be very clear, this is a much broader problem that encompasses, economics, diplomacy, values, a whole host of other areas at sort of the strategic level. And I think, look, they very much see themselves as harnessing emerging technologies to leapfrog the United States into a position of global preeminence, global leadership, where, it's unclear how they would actually, conduct business when they kind of reach that position of power. But all indications are pretty concerning as to, how they're using emerging technologies at home, using them to sort of further social control, crony capitalism, spheres of influence abroad. This is very contrary, I think, to the world in which the United States has been seeking to help to build and want to live in for the future. At a military level, they have been working pretty methodically and systematically for the past 3 decades, not to play the same game as the United States, but to play a different game. And I think the position that the United States has been put in is, one of having been disrupted. And I think we are the being forced to play a losing game because of the choices that China's made as to how it's building up and modernizing its military. And if you look at it, this is not something that kind of hit us one day like a hurricane. This has been underway for a very long period of time, and it's been very methodical. So, all the way back to the first Gulf War, you had a team from the PLA that actually went to Baghdad that looked at the aftermath of this conflict. And I think what alarmed them so much was that the United States, had destroyed a lot of Saddam Hussein's military, but more importantly, they won the war. We won the war by reaching into Iraq and essentially destroying the ability of Saddam Hussein's forces to fight. And the belief was that if they could do that, if we could do that to Iraq, we could do that to China, which at the time had much the same military capability as Saddam Hussein's did, sort of old Soviet legacy systems. And what began at that point was a very systematic plan to build up a different kind of military. And it was very focused on calling into question and undermining the assumptions on which the United States has built its military and planned to project power for decades. So, building up longer and longer ranges, intermediate range, long range, medium range ballistic missiles to go after US forward bases in the region, building up very formidable networks of integrated air defense systems to go after aircraft that would be looking to strike Chinese assets or Chinese territory. Building anti-ship ballistic missiles and anti-ship cruise missiles and the longer range sensors, long range reconnaissance satellites, over the horizon radar to identify the carrier and the battle group that would be moving in as a power projection platform, trying to systematically push those assets farther and farther away and out of operational range. And then ultimately building what the Chinese call, systems destruction warfare capabilities related to going after communications, command and control, intelligence, space assets, basically all of the underlying ways in which the United States moves information and commands and controls its forces in the event of a conflict, to essentially break the U.S. battle network and the ability to close the kill chain, to use military parlance. Again, this is something that has been systematically underway for a very long period of time. And the United States, I think, has found itself in a bit of a frog in the pot scenario where piece by piece, these military capabilities are coming together in China. To be clear, they're not 10 feet tall. It's not to suggest that the United States has no areas of advantage or no ability to respond effectively. I very much don't believe that. But it is to say that I think we have been forced into the position of playing a losing game for a very long period of time. And rather than seeking ways to get out of that predicament, play a different game, offset the ways China's been building its military, all too often we've been doubling down on the same things that we've been doing in the past. And I think that it's now put us in a position where years and years of those kinds of choices, have now limited our ability to maneuver and made this crisis or made this problem into, what I would believe is, kind of a looming crisis in how America thinks about building its forces and using them operationally.
And so that's where I want to get to, right? So you make the case that it is time for radical change, given the stakes are so high, right? And the dangers of this so high that once your adversary concludes that you either have clay feet or you have forces that are wholly ill-suited to the challenge or the threats that they're creating for you, it doesn't matter whether the senior-most U.S. military leadership says, oh, you know what, we're doing great, and it's a question of minor adaptation of our systems, which you, I think, make clear in the book that that's really not the case, and that time and time in these war game scenarios, we end up losing very, very badly. Talk to us about the kind of strategic systemic change is necessary without which we lose and China wins.
Yeah, and to be very clear, when I talk about the types of capabilities the Chinese are building and fielding, some might look at that and say, well, it's inherently defensive in nature. We can argue that, but they also have a whole series of other capabilities that they have been putting out in terms of a blue water navy, kind of traditional power projection type forces. And I think the biggest concern to me is the erosion or loss of conventional deterrence and what it would mean in a world where China does have the ability to begin to project control out into large areas of the world that the United States fundamentally cares about, that are absolutely meaningful to us in the sense of our allies, our partners, our interests, our way of life. Those kinds of things are, it's the question of where China is going and the uncertain nature of, how they would seek to use that power is, I think, what is most concerning to me. In terms of how we respond and sort of the strategic, systemic nature of it, what I try to do in the book is make it very clear. What I'm very much not suggesting is that there's going to be some magic bullet, right? It's not like artificial intelligence is going to save us. There's not some deus ex machina that in the next year or two are, somehow going to make everything right. It's more about fixing the systems and processes that got us into this problem. And I think those are the things that we need to begin to get right so that we can carry out what I believe is going to be a long transition, but it's going to be a transition we're going to have to move through somewhat urgently to get from the force that we have to the force that we need. And, I think the other final point to underscore is that, we don't really know what that force is going to look like. I mean, I have inclinations as to how these technologies, I think, can come together to enable us to build different kinds of systems, right? So, kind of larger in quantity, smaller, more distributed, more autonomous, more expendable. I think that's right, but how it's actually going to come together, what those systems are going to look like, how we're going to have to resolve the operational problems associated with, operating in these kinds of environments. That's very much something I think we're going to have to experiment our way through. And I think that's the big systemic issue that I would sort of highlight here is that the reason we have found ourselves in this predicament is because of a systemic failure, not because we failed to buy, one specific system or, take one, particular technology most seriously. It's because we were overconfident about our ability to predict the future and be dominant in that future. So it's the requirements process that says, I know exactly what 2030 is going to look like, and I can predict exactly the capabilities that I'm going to have to build now to be successful in that world 10 years from now. I joke that if I had to write the requirements for my mobile device, today I would have the best flip phone in America. We've got to flip this around and be a little bit more humble about the ways in which our adversaries get a vote, the way they're going to develop technology, and the way technology is going to allow us to do different things that we can't even begin to foresee this year, to say nothing of 1, 5, 10 years into the future. So it's more about setting up systems and processes that enable us to bring the best technology that's currently available in quickly, put them into the hands of operators so that they can undertake real world experimentation and exercises focused on actual operational problems that our military is going to have to solve in these kinds of environments. Very clearly baseline the performance of what we are trying to do, not in an input driven way about, how can I make my traditional platform fly a little bit farther or shoot a little bit farther, but how can I close the kill chain? How can I understand, decide, and act faster at larger scale, more dynamically, more flexibly? Those to me are going to be the things that we have to baseline ourselves against. And then just every year figure out how we can do better, how we can do faster, how we can scale larger, and use that as an opportunity to on-ramp new technologies and scale winning solutions quickly. And that to me has been, again, one of those systemic failures is we do a lot of science projects, we do a lot of interesting prototypes, but very rarely do those promising things make it across the valley of death and scale into large, military programs. That's the thing that we're going to have to get right here, or we're going to find ourselves in 5 years in the same position that we're in today.
So from, what was interesting when you were talking was if you, go back, the Chinese and the Russians really studied Andy Marshall, whether in the early 1990s or in 2000s in terms of the capabilities. Art Zebrowski, Admiral, the late Admiral Zebrowski also was talking about pushing to the edges, more distributed, greater number, more use of autonomy. So we had visionaries who were telling our force where to go. We just weren't interested in doing that. And I think what's worse is have made less relevant, very expensive platforms. So the United States Navy builds the world's best aircraft carrier. You talk about incrementalism and sort of risk avoidance. So we have a tendency of building better versions of the exact same thing, and then actually not equipping it with the X-47s and the long-range unmanned aircraft, only to find that that's exactly what the Chinese are looking to do, to stretch the arms of the platform. As somebody who was studying, Chris, and trying to drive that change with your boss, former boss, how do we do it? How do we get there? And what's the window we have to try to get this right? Because it's a very small window in which to get it right.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of answers to that question. I mean, I think at sort of the broadest level, we've got to focus on the right things. And that sounds very simple, but it's also something that I think that time and time again, we actually fail to do. That we've become so enamored of the things that we have used that have delivered our military dominance for decades that we almost can't think beyond why we have them in the first place. So the reason I sort of embrace the idea of the kill chain as a metaphor, and I very much try to write this book not just for, or even say not at all for the sort of experts and specialists and people inside the defense establishment who know these issues, far better than I do. But I really wanted to try to reach a broader audience and try to explain these concepts in a way that a broader audience could understand, and sort of begin to develop, I think, the sense of urgency that we need as a nation to get after these problems. But I embrace the idea of the kill chain because I actually think that is the thing that we are trying to accomplish. We are not trying to build a 355 ship Navy or a 386 squadron Air Force, or build an aircraft carrier with electromagnetic catapults. The goal is constantly more around how do I increase the quality and speed with which I can make sense of the battle space? How do I put human beings in a position where they can make better, faster, more effective decisions than our competitors? And then how can they orchestrate or direct actions, effects, take shots that are going to be, again, faster, more scalable, more flexible than our opponents? That's how we win. And by win, I mean, that's how we deter conflict, by being, so clearly capable of winning if conflict ever happened. Those are the things that we need to baseline against. And to me, it's something, I'd love to be back on the SAS to a certain degree to kind of be thinking about these problems from a government perspective, but it's actually even more, relevant from the industry and kind of defense startup position that I'm in now. We need a different kind of language for thinking about how we evaluate the military capabilities we're building through the lens of an integrated battle network. We think of it in terms of evaluating individual platforms. Can this particular fighter jet defeat that particular air defense system? Can this weapon shoot farther than that weapon? Those are attributes of platforms or requirements of platforms. We need to be thinking about how we build networks of systems with attributes that enable understanding, decision-making, and action at speed, at scale. And that, I think, helps us to begin understanding how these technologies can become operationally relevant. We talk all the time about artificial intelligence in the military. And I think most of us, most people just don't really understand what exactly that's going to enable us to do. But if we're thinking of it through the lens of enabling and accelerating understanding, decision, action, kill chains, that I think gives us a clearer sense of how these technologies can be made operationally relevant today, and put us on a path to kind of increased capability development down the road. To me, we've got to start getting these larger things right. And again, we're not set up, I think, institutionally, to some extent, in terms of our acquisition, our budgeting process. It's very much geared around buying, developing, testing, evaluating, and using the things that we have always had and the ways that we have always used them. And unless we start thinking about it in the sense of, no, I'm building networks of capabilities that are going to be interchangeable, that are going to be, constantly upgrading. And ultimately, I don't actually care about the parameters or requirements or capabilities of a single platform. I care about the attributes and effectiveness and speed and scalability of the network. I think it leads us to look at these decisions that we have to make very differently, because ultimately we're trying, we're focusing on a different outcome than I think our system is geared to produce. So again, our system has been optimized for decades now to more efficiently, more effectively, acquire the things we have always acquired. I don't think we actually do that particularly well, but we definitely aren't. We definitely don't have a system that is focused on that end state that we're trying to achieve in terms of networks of systems and how you actually architect and build networked capability. We've talked about this for 30 years. I mean, network-centric warfare is as old as I am. It's just what's striking to me as I've gone back and sort of looked at, a lot of the writing and a lot of the thinking that was done in the 1990s and 2000s is how strikingly similar it is to the things that we're saying today in 2020 with the National Defense Strategy and, the focus on emerging technologies today. I think that leads us to ask, why did we fail to do so many of the things that we said were important and necessary for such a long period of time? Which again, to me, gets back to, we have systemic problems that we have got to get right, or we can turn the dials all we want, but we're still not going to get the right solutions and the right outcomes.
Well, right. I mean, part of the problem is that we do have a degree of hubris about how we're going to go around doing this, and being the world's hyperpower contributes to that sense of invincibility, right? There's nothing we can do. But then when you start to strip it away, you realize that we're preparing to fight how it is we imagine that fight to go, as opposed to how our enemies imagine they're going to fight us, right? Or the reality of how they're going to fight us. And there's that disconnect there. I guess the question, let me just get to what you think our time frame window is, because there is a bit of resignation in how you go about saying this, right? You lay out the case, and then it's like, look, this is going to be very hard. And you've stressed that. And I think everybody acknowledges it's going to be very hard. Yeah. Well, what do you think the time window is? And then I want to dig a little bit deeper with you, because you are one of the people who does understand how to take that just to see clearly the picture, if I may, and then figure out what you do in policy to drive the right outcome, even if people are resisting you, right? But first, let's talk about the time frame. What's our window? Is it five years? Because there are some people who will tell you, Chris, that they think that the reason China is acting as aggressively as it's acting is that they actually no longer believe that there is much of a constraint on their power, and why Xi is moving as aggressively as he is in Hong Kong, and why he actually may move aggressively elsewhere. And obviously the concern there is Taiwan. How big do you think, have we lost deterrence already? And if not, how big is our window before we do lose it?
That's a great question. I don't think that we have lost deterrence yet, by virtue of the fact that, every day that we wake up and, China has made a decision not to do something aggressively, not to, use military power to achieve a certain end state, is a day that you could make an argument that deterrence is still there. But I think it's fragile, and I do think it's eroding, and I think it's eroding quickly. I'm not sure what time frame I would put on the loss of it. The bigger thing I would say is that the trajectory that we are on is toward the loss of it. And exactly as you said, what is most concerning about this is, in the process of losing deterrence, the competitor becomes more emboldened about what they can do, and the tools with which they can do it. I think part of our concern, or part of our problem, is that we've been living in a world for so long where we have been dominant, that we've just come to believe and assume that certain things are just not possible anymore. It is possible, in my mind, that China could use military force to achieve certain policy outcomes, in Taiwan or in Southeast Asia, in a way that would be calling into question commitments that the United States has made and maintained for a very long period of time, where it would force very difficult policy choices for us. That is the concern that I have, is that this loss of deterrence, in the minds of the Chinese Communist Party, the appetite will grow with the eating. And I think that we've been seeing this for a very long period of time already. And I worry kind of where that's going to go. So as to the time frame, look, the cop-out answer is, we have no time to lose. I would argue that we, in the next, 2, 3, 4 years, really need to get the sort of broader, sort of systemic pieces right. The kinds of things that I write about at the end of the book, that if we don't have those, kind of large levers pulled in the right direction, we can monkey around with the dials all we want, and sort of move money betwixt and between programs, but it's not going to get us to the right outcome. I think we've got to get the foundational pieces set pretty urgently. And I say urgently as in like the next couple years. And then I think we need to recognize that the process of experimentation toward the type of force that we're going to need, sort of making that force better and better each year, is something that's going to take time to play out. But I think, in terms of the mindset shift, in terms of the large muscle movements inside the Department of Defense and inside the Congress, that needs to happen now. But I'd say, we probably have, a couple of years to really kind of get that set. And if we don't, we're just kicking that can down the road. And I think with every passing year, we lose greater position of strategic advantage. And I would argue that we've already lost, a lot of that, in year after year here, where, the promise of every forthcoming budget was this was going to be the place where we really made the big moves, made the big changes. And it seems like that story, that narrative keeps getting postponed a year and then another year and then another year. We can't afford to lose this time. This isn't the 1990s where, the United States can afford to be, slow and able to make mistakes and largely make up for it. I think every year that we fail to get after this problem aggressively is a year that we fall, or become at greater risk of falling further behind.
Let me take you to what we do about it. So let me make you president, or senior advisor to the president, irrespective of who's in power. What are the systemic 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 things that we have to do to get this right?
So again, I would focus on the sort of big foundational pieces. We have got to make it very clear, what the priority is with respect to the military choices that we're making operationally, in terms of acquisition, research and development. I think, the focus on China is correct for a host of reasons that we've been talking about, others that we can get into. I think we then have to sort of break that problem down into, the operational problems that we would actually have to solve, to ensure that we can maintain conventional deterrence in that region. But again, a lot of this is also not just about ways and means. I think it's also about thinking that there are certain things in terms of end states that we have said for a very long period of time that we want to be able to accomplish, that I'm increasingly believing are no longer practical. That we're not going to have dominance the way that we have for many decades. And we have to be thinking differently about the ways in which we can still achieve the defense of the people, places, things, interests that matter most to us in a world where we don't have the kind of military dominance or preeminence or primacy that we've long enjoyed. I think once you've broken that problem down and focused very clearly on the types of threats that you're encountering, we need to devote more of our force and more of our resources toward real world experimentation. There are certain large programs that you're not going to be able to compete them and open them up and sort of inject competition the way that you would try to do with other programs. An aircraft carrier is not something that you're going to have a lot of different competitors trying to build, and you can change the requirements and sort of open up that system to competition year over year. But most of the systems that I think we're buying and developing in the defense world, we can be much better about creating real world environments where every year there is money set aside at the beginning of the process, focused on the highest priority operational problems that we are trying to solve as a nation. Where the SecDef, I would argue, should hold back a certain amount of resources in sort of a traditional bishop fund or whatever you want to call it, but they need to be very focused on real world events that are going to determine how we spend that money. I think where we have failed in the past with bishops funds, or kind of holding back 5% of the budget, or pick your amount, is that if we aren't actually taking systems out and trying to do the thing in the real world that we are actually going to have to do in combat, then we end up in the same rooms arguing over the same points with no more data, no more information. And, it ends up being sort of a contest of argument and, assertion. And then it ends up in a messy compromise where, just to kind of get the thing done, everybody gets a little bit. Congress kind of gives each side a half a loaf of bread, and we live to fight another day. We have got to actually sharpen the distinctions on what is working and what is not, and make it a much more open competition, so that the military services industry, new and old, large and small, the research laboratories, everybody can understand what are the problems, the most important outcomes that the nation is trying to deliver in the building of military forces. What are the events that are going to determine, who has winning capabilities and who doesn't? And how can I get myself into a position where I can compete each year for more and more resources for a solution that is actually going to be demonstrably proven to be more effective than other things that are out there. I think that's how you create sort of a level playing field among different kinds of capabilities. I think it's how you begin to create incentives to on-ramp new capabilities and scale them quickly. And I think it's how you also create incentives for interesting synergies to begin to emerge between the services, between companies, where, between old and new, systems, where the focus is on, at an operational level, how do I take the things that are available to me now, whether it's a 60-year-old platform or a brand new technology, and put them together to do something operationally useful or new or different. That to me is the answer. Again, like, I'm not trying to suggest in this book that, all these whiz-bang artificial intelligence and new technologies are going to magically save us. At the end of the day, the thing that matters most is what we do with them, how they enable us to operate differently. And unless we're actually baselining against that and measuring that and showing performance on that, and doing real world experimentation, where large amounts of money are at stake, relatively speaking, inside of the defense budget process every year, we're not going to be making those improvements. Again, it's just going to be a lot of paper exercises. It's going to be a lot of argument and assertion without, meaningful movements of money toward the more effective capabilities that we're going to need to be successful, year after year after year.
How do you drive this change in a little bit of a more of a mechanical manner, up on the Hill, right? On the one hand, we couldn't get there with a John McCain who was interested in driving the system. And even John McCain became stymied, was seen by program managers sometimes as this formidable force that, let's be totally risk averse because I don't want to get beat up by him. Yeah. At the same time, one of his own members, Kelly Ayotte, because her husband flew the A-10, blocked the Air Force from retiring the A-10, even though retiring the A-10 was the right thing to do, right? So if we couldn't get this done with the John McCain as chairman of the House Senate Armed Services Committee, how do we do this change when there doesn't seem to be as reform-minded focus? I'm not reducing at all Senator Inhofe's view of it or Jack Reed's view of it any more than I'm contesting, that Adam Smith isn't interested in driving real change, because I think he is. We'll see who his Republican counterpart's going to be, whether it's going to be Turner or Rogers. How do we try to get there, given that lawmakers, and as you said, the bandwidth is focused on the greater, the lesser prairie chicken and the greater sage grouse and a burying beetle ends up taking more of the bandwidth than fundamentally how to make an aircraft carrier more effective, right? So how do we do this, given that the legislature has an incredibly powerful role to play in driving these changes? We wouldn't have Predators if it wasn't for John Warner saying, you're putting Predators in there and that's the future of warfare, even though you don't realize it now.
Right. So I think the Congress is going to be a difficult nut to crack. And I think, what I try to say in the book is, look, there's just a lot of things that are going to be realities that we have to deal with, contend with, and work with, rather than try to wish away or, kind of hand wave away. Members of Congress are going to be driven by things that will get them reelected. It's not the only thing that's going to drive them, but it is always going to be a consideration. And those things are not always going to be, the future of warfare and, the most compelling things that the United States military needs to do right now. It's going to be, the lesser prairie chickens or, the issue that my guard unit has, all of which are important, but none of which I would say, is, can be the sum total of what the Congress needs to focus on. I think the other thing I would say is, like, part of what I'm trying to suggest in this book is, yes, we do need leadership, absolutely. But we also, I think, need, a system or a process that is capable of being successful year over year without sort of the great man theory of history or the great woman theory of history. John McCain, I think, did a lot right. I think made a lot of large changes. I didn't agree with everything that he tried to do, and I certainly wasn't as involved in a lot of those decisions before, becoming staff director in 2015. I think what I tried to do when I was there, was make it clear to the department that we did want them to run certain kinds of risks, right? I mean, bad risks are putting all of your eggs in one basket, having a lot of hopes and dreams about how the future is going to turn out, spending an extraordinary amount of money on it, and then realizing that you're 2x the schedule and 5x the cost down the road, and you still don't have an operational capability. I think we wanted them to think differently about risk and the right kinds of risks that they should be taking, and give them, the acquisition authorities, additional resources as best we could sort of create that to do that. But I think with respect to the Congress, it's really going to be a lot of the department is going to have to make it clear to the Congress, where are its priorities? What are the things that they really need Congress's help on? And I think for Congress, there's going to need to be a much more visceral understanding of the consequences of business as usual. A lot of that is going to have to come from the leadership of the defense committees. It's certainly something that we tried to do when I was there. I think a lot of it is also going to have to come from the department, and making it very clear, look, the budget request that we're sending over is backed up by these real world exercises or experimentation events that we have done, where I can show you, like, actually in real terms, what was achievable, what was possible, what we actually did to inform the resource decisions that we're recommending. Because I think in the absence of that, again, it becomes argument and assertion. The department hides the ball. Congress, then has to sort of figure out how to do the puts and takes. I just think that, the process needs to be more informed by actual experimentation, actual data that helps the Congress understand the significance of the choices that they have to make, and more clearly understand the trade-offs and consequences. So that investing in this today at the expense of that will likely lead to the following consequence. And to be very clear, the members of Congress will own that, not the department that recommended, a different decision.
Right.
Those are, I think, the ways, again, it at sort of the larger level, at sort of the systemic level, we have to get those kinds of things right, from a process standpoint, from sort of a movement of information, alignment of interest standpoint, so that at least we're sort of rowing in the same direction, rather than, sort of operating in an environment of, kind of lack of information, distrust, and sort of cross purposes. There's always going to be the checking and the balancing, and that's good and useful. But I think we've got to be a lot clearer about, year after year, what are the problems we're trying to solve? What are the actual events where we're going to determine what are the things that are capable of performing the best right now? What are the winners that we need to pick? And really using that to determine where we're going to put our, major investments year over year, and do it in a way that Congress and the Department of Defense are looking at the problem in the same way. And that's going to mean the department's going to have to bring Congress in a lot more so than I think they have traditionally been comfortable doing. And Congress is going to have to recognize that, being part of that process means that they are going to have, greater responsibility put on them for the consequences of these decisions. This is something that really has to happen in a much more joint way than I think, at least in my experience, I saw that play out.
One follow-up and one wrap-up question. The last administration did focus a lot of effort on Strategic Capabilities Office. You had Ash Carter's drive to bring Silicon Valley in. Part of that was driven with an enormous frustration with heritage contractors. Heritage contractors didn't particularly like that approach. And as you've noted in the book, the people who are interested in the work may not be able to do it. Those people who could do the work may not be interested in doing it from a Silicon Valley standpoint. What are the lessons learned during that experience, right? I mean, DIUX was launched, but the concern was that there wasn't enough money behind any of this, that there wasn't a clear path to take, as you said, a very clever idea and then rapidly operationalize it and get it to the field. Yeah. Given that the challenge we now face is we need to redo the networks, we need to create the new systems, we need to reuse the existing systems in order to be able to create that deterrent space. So what are the lessons that we've learned from how we've done this in the past that need to inform how we do this in the future? And I just want to end it with a budget question.
Sure. I think the strategic, the SCOs, the DIUs, a lot of organizations, kind of innovation-focused organizations that you see in the department right now, I think many of them struggled to figure out what problem they were trying to solve. You've seen kind of those organizations go through different iterations. To me, the most important problem, or I think where they've added value, is that they are actually helping to bring new entrants in. Right? It has never been easier to get a small contract to do work for the Department of Defense today. I think that is a demonstrably true statement. I think it's thanks to the DIUs and the AFWorks and organizations like that. To some extent, though, that has not actually traditionally been the biggest problem. The biggest problem, and I think CSIS's report from last year documented this like in appalling detail. The problem has been that the timelines for return, the ability of companies to scale work that they are doing, kind of bridging that valley of death, that's what's actually been driving companies out of the defense sector. And so you've seen thousands of companies exit after a few years of just not being able to get something going or to scale it. So I think part of the problem we've got right now is it has never been easier to get new entrants in to do something small, but it has also been never harder to identify the winners and sort of the top 1%, the sort of differentiating performers among those new companies, and scale them into larger and larger programs of record, et cetera. I think part of it too is, that to me is the incentive structure that begins to fuel a different kind of mindset in Silicon Valley, in the technology community, in the investment community. I think the reason you've seen so many companies not wanting to do work with the Department of Defense, so many engineers looking to make their future in the commercial sector, so many investors not interested in investing in defense and national security oriented startups and companies, is because they haven't actually believed that that's a pathway to success, to larger companies and to greater returns on investment. And there's a lot of empirical evidence to suggest that that's unfortunately been true. So I think getting those incentives right is part of the way that you're slowly going to begin attracting that different kind of talent, different kinds of companies, more private investment into the defense sector. But the thing that I would just underscore is, like, just as I don't believe that artificial intelligence is going to be the magic bullet for us, I'm also not here to say that I think Silicon Valley is going to save us. I think it's more about trying to structure an environment where very clearly what it is you're trying to build, what the performance metrics are, what the standards of success are, and knowing clearly that if you can meet those standards and win in real world competitive kind of environments, there's a path to get a lot of money very quickly, and you can scale very quickly. Whether that is a company that nobody has ever heard of that was founded 2 years ago, or whether that is a traditional defense contractor that is a household name. It should matter only about the end state and the capability. And where there are opportunities for those types of companies to team up and get you an even better capability, we need to have incentives that make that more likely rather than less likely. So that to me, I think, is the thing we've got to get right. And I think if you do get it right, you'll start to see more interest to do this defense work on the part of the technology community. Because in my experience, and certainly what I've seen since leaving government and working in technology, is there are a lot of people in the technology community who want to do this work, either because they're patriots and they believe it's the right thing to do, or they're capitalists and they believe that this is a way to build a successful company and become successful themselves. Ultimately, it's also, I think, because they're engineers and they're drawn to hard problems. And the defense world has, kind of a monopoly on some of the hardest problems and most exciting problems out there. We just need to make it less hard for these people to do this work, and more likely that the best performers are going to be able to succeed at scale faster than has traditionally been the case for the past several decades.
Last question on budget. There is an understanding, I think, that $750 billion is going to be a high watermark in spending. The nation is grappling with coronavirus. Ideally, the economy rebounds a lot faster, but we're now trillions of dollars of stimulus that have added to the national debt. There's lost tax revenue. And on top of that, the American people are demonstrating in a way that we haven't seen in decades on issues of social justice. That's likely to also mean perhaps another round of healthcare reconsideration, that part of the challenge we had was that the public health system is not as strong, perhaps as it needs to be, especially for those who may be disadvantaged.
Yeah.
How does this affect this moment? Does it drive greater clarity, greater prioritization? I mean, that's something, it's one of my favorite expressions. I know it was one of your boss's favorite expressions as well, was, if everything's important, nothing is important, right? You have to set priorities. What are your biggest operational problems to resolve before you make trade-offs, right? I mean, effectively, Chris, you're calling for the kind of gigantic choices like no longer building aircraft carriers, right? I mean, that carries hundreds of thousands of jobs along with it, potentially. How do you think the budget situation, how do you see the budget situation as somebody who did that for 10 years up on the Hill? And does it potentially help us or not?
So I think everything you said is right. I think that defense budgets had basically, hit a high water mark before all of the events that you just described. And I think it actually started turning down even before this. All of this, I think, is just going to make defense spending, as far as I can see into the future, take a pretty significant downturn. That would be my prediction. If I were making assumptions on future force planning, I would be assuming that I'm going to be operating in sort of a new era of defense austerity. I personally think that the kinds of things that I'm writing in the book, the kinds of choices, reforms, changes that we need to make, were all necessary before all of this. And I think the current sort of situation, crisis, and events just make it all the more necessary and really indispensable that we make these changes. Because the path that we were going on, we could throw $800, $900 billion, $1 trillion at that old approach, and I don't think that it was going to actually get us to where we need to go. Like, the first thing that we've got to recognize is that because we're playing a losing game, we've got to stop playing the game that we're playing. We've got to play a different game, and I think the reality is that it will be absolutely fiscally constrained. My hope is that, unfortunately, if you go back and rewind the clock 10 years, in the Budget Control Act and the aftermath of the Great Recession, we kind of had this moment of opportunity to think differently, and we didn't really. We kind of wished it away. We kind of doubled down on old priorities and sort of, cannibalized ourselves in a lot of important ways, but largely kept doing most of the things that we had been doing. That's just not going to work now. I mean, a decade later, we're in a much more dire predicament, in my opinion. And I think the resource constraints, into the future are going to be even more severe. It has to be an impetus for change. I mean, it doesn't mean that it's going to guarantee change. By no means does it do that. But it's got to be an impetus to say, if we don't start thinking differently and playing a different game, we're just going to lose faster, especially as money dries up for the traditional approaches and systems that we have long relied upon. How we make that change, to your point about, divesting of large legacy systems and programs, to me, that stuff is going to have to be on the table. And I think the only way we're going to be able to make those choices and sustain those choices successfully. And I'm not here to tell you that I've got all of the answers for what we need to divest from. What I am here to say is that I don't think that we adequately have a system to inform those choices right now in a way that would give me a lot of confidence, as a member of Congress who stands to lose jobs or bases or factories, that decision that the Department of Defense is trying to get me to make, is informed, that has, gone through real test and evaluation or rigorous kind of examination, real world experimentation, and that there are better things coming. And I think this is the challenge, is that, in an ideal world, you kind of give things up when you know exactly what the replacement capability is going to be, and it's sort of on hand. We're going to have to make these choices in the absence of a lot of those capabilities being here now. Some of it, we're going to be able to kind of, work a transition where new things can emerge and we can slowly let go of old things. Some of them we're going to have to take on faith because they're just going to be too costly to maintain, and we're going to have to start cutting into actual force structure a lot faster if the resource kind of fiscal restraints, come a lot steeper, than maybe the folks in the department are thinking about. Anyway, we're going to have a system for evaluating these choices and trade-offs in the aggregate, which right now I still don't feel like we have. It's still going to be, his word against his or her word against his.
Right.
And that's I think where we've ended up in problems in the past. We've got to have something that's more driven toward outcomes, data, and performance. And even then, it's going to be a difficult political fight.
Is this something that's doable by redirecting, say, $30 billion a year, or is it $30 billion a year working more closely with allies? I mean, the reality is some of our allies have kind of clever ways of solving problems, in part because they don't have the resources we have. Is this something that you can get away with by working more closely with our friends and then doing, say, redirecting 30 or 40 or $50 billion that maybe can get greater utility of some of these bigger platforms that we have at the end of the day? Is that doable, or is it much more of a systemic change?
No, I think that level of resourcing, kind of used in a different way consistently. I mean, again, this is not like a problem that we're going to solve in one budget cycle. It's going to be, year after year after year, kind of turning the tanker in a different direction. Allies will be able to help. They're not going to save us. But the kinds of movements of resources that you're talking about, I mean, I sort of, take a stab at it, maybe 5% of the defense budget. If we every year could sort of hold that back and really focus on making, kind of pointed investments and scaled investments in capabilities that demonstrably show inside of that budget process are superior at closing the kill chain than the alternatives. Like, I think that's how you begin incrementally moving in the kind of radically different direction that I think we have to go. But again, I think it's about focusing on the problem that you're trying to solve, which to me is the kill chain. It's about having a level playing field where, new entrants, old players, anybody, can compete and understand the problem that's needing to be solved, the measurement for performance, and know very clearly that there are resources that senior leaders are going to be able to drive into those types of capabilities, based on their performance. And that's how we're going to begin to change. But, even then, if the top line contracts more steeply or faster, there's going to be no way around making these kinds of choices and fielding the kind of force that we're going to need to without, significantly cutting into force structure. Right. And that, I think, is going to be, that's going to be, politically very difficult, but it to me is unavoidable if the kinds of, constraints that I see coming on the defense budget, actually come to pass, or if they happen even more steeply.
Well, Chris, thanks very much for joining us. It's a very important book. I suggest people read it, get it and read it. And I've also got to say that, your argument that some of the biggest things we've done is because of great people who we have empowered. We didn't get a chance to talk about it this time, but, President Eisenhower putting Bernie Schriever in charge, or a Hyman Rickover in charge, or an Admiral Moffett in charge to sort of drive heretical ideas, even against the opposition of people in their own services. Yep. We've managed to do tremendous things on incredibly short timelines because there were hard problems that we needed to solve. And I'm increasingly believe that the single most important discriminator we have, that we are most actively damaging, is our structure of alliances, which appears to be the only thing that gets Beijing to actually even reconsider anything, as if a wall of people stand up to oppose, which is not a military capability at the end of the day, but is right. Core to deterrence. Thanks so much for spending so much time with us. Really appreciate it. You're welcome back on any time.
Thanks. It was great to be with you and really appreciate it. Thanks, Vago.
Thanks for joining us. Please follow our daily interviews and subscribe to our weekly newsletter. Follow us on Twitter, on Facebook, and LinkedIn, and check out our weekly cyber report sponsored by Northrop Grumman. For more than 80 years, Bell has pushed past the boundaries of what's possible to drive aviation forward, going above and beyond flight. Bellflight.com. Thanks again to Bell for their generous sponsorship, and we'll see you again tomorrow.